Just a heads up, this video is a sequel to my Split China video from a few weeks ago. I originally wanted to combine this with my Superpower Brazil timeline, but I had no idea where to even start. Regardless, here's a link to the China video if you want to watch it and come back here, but I'll give a quick recap of the timeline from here. In 1947, the Kuomantang and CCP started the second phase of the Chinese Civil War, and in this timeline the Kuomantang did much better at holding the communists in Manchuria, leading to the UN, America, and the Soviets, let's be real, to force through a ceasefire splitting the country, with the Soviets getting rid of Mao. The Korean War either never happened or was delayed, and in the case of the latter was a quick defeat for the DPRK. In Vietnam, a similar turn of events led to the US being able to properly invade the North, ending the war by 1970 under the Saigon Government. The lack of a Red China left the Cold War much more moderate, which led to the West agreeing to create a neutral, disarmed, but united Germany. From there, the Kuomintang government would be forced to liberalize in the 1960s, and due to the American conquests in Korea and Vietnam, break with the US and create a third pillar as nation power. However, it did not start working with the Soviets like our China did with the US due to the existence of Manchuria. So before we get really into it, when I do these sequels, I like to respond to major questions people had surrounding the original version. One of the ones that piqued my interest was the idea that China wouldn't get Tibet or East Turkestan. And yeah, East Turkestan is kind of weird. Based on what I'm seeing, the PRC entered the region in 1949, and despite the Soviets propping up a client state in the area, they didn't seem to actually care that much. In contrast, Tibet wasn't even nominally tied to the Soviets or America, so the question remains a bit more up in the air. So while I'm not a fan of retcons, I'll admit it doesn't really make sense for the Soviets to accept losing the area without a fight in this timeline, especially since they're already propping up Manchuria. Now, how long that region lasts after the fall of the Soviets, I don't know. However, Tibet, I think, will still suffer the invasion. The Kuomintang has all the same reasons to as the PRC, with both considering it a part of the Chinese core. In addition, a few people asked about why I had the superpowers released in neutral Germany. I'll admit, that isn't super likely, but it was a real proposal floated by the Soviets a few times, and my reasoning was that it shortened the nominal front line of a conventional World War III. Add in that it would actually harm Soviet logistics since they would need to take back East Germany if they used that route to invade, and it made sense to me. Finally, a few people raised an eyebrow about the democratizing China so early, pointing out the amount of people sympathetic to the communist cause. But that was actually why I had them democratize. See, in my mind, without the Great Leap Forward, China wouldn't be able to maintain the autocracy that Chiang wanted to implement. And even then, officially the Kuomintang always wanted to move toward democracy eventually. The time was just never quite right. And in case I didn't say that sarcastically enough, I'm spelling it out now. Also, I fucked up during that video. I consistently called the leader of Nationalist China Chiang Kai-shek, not Chiang Kai-shek. At the time of writing, I could have sworn Wiki said it was an accepted Romanization, but when I was double checking something else, this seemed to be untrue. I even made sure to use Chiangism to refer to the ideology. I'm not sure how many appearances he'll make here, but that was still my bad. Regardless, what's the rest of the world looking like in 1992? Well, North China, Manchuria, is still around since it's big enough to actually survive as its own country despite a land border with the Republic. The question is, what government emerges after the collapse? I originally assumed that it would come into some level of democracy like most of the Warsaw Pact states, but considering the other precedents of Russia, North Korea, Belarus, and frankly Yugoslavia, it very well might not. If Manchuria goes that route, I would expect it to become a highly militant society. Whether it's the Communist Party or a more generic junta, I'm not sure. I'm not really going to turn it into North Korea or anything, since frankly even that took a lot of very specific societal trauma and the exact right kinds of madmen. Instead, North China is a rationalist, autocratic regime like any other. Regardless, its mere existence is a sore spot for the nationalists in China, seeing the breakaway state as proof that the century of humiliation is not yet over. Oh, I'm sorry, why am I zooming in on Formosa? Although, of course, that comparison should be expanded on. Like I said last time, Manchuria is a bigger strategic problem for the ROC than the island of Taiwan would have been for the PRC. In addition to being a land border capable of mustering a decently sized army, Manchuria has a lot of industrial resources that China would very much like to get their hands on. In contrast, while Taiwan was important for the mainland's naval security, it's primarily a political problem for them rather than a military one. Or at least, it's only as much of a military problem as South Korea and Japan are. We already talked about how Manchuria would be a military dictatorship of some variety, but what about economically? Well, it was likely the most industrialized part of the Warsaw Pact with the exception of the Soviets themselves. In addition, in terms of per capita, it would likely be doing better than the area does in real life, because Mao did a lot of damage and had no opportunity to replicate that here. However, its highly restricted economy and generally lacking diplomatic chances would mean that in all likelihood, post-communist Manchuria would stagnate under its authoritarian leadership. That being said, however, there is a chance that they wind up being at least somewhat democratic like Taiwan in real life, and in that scenario, it would likely wind up being highly divided between Manchurian nationalists, or North Chinese nationalists since they wouldn't actually be like ethnically Manchurian, and pro-unification factions. I won't really guess whether the nationalists would be on the left or right, since China itself is such a right-wing country that it could make sense one way or the other, but it is worth considering. As a rule, though, I would put Manchuria at around the level of East Germany or communist Czechoslovakia, better than the rest of the Warsaw Pact, but not on the level of a first world nation. Regardless, China also has problems with countries like Mongolia and even India. Now, Mongolia spent the better part of the Cold War as a Soviet puppet, just like Manchuria, though it's probably much easier to conquer or otherwise force the issue than North China is. However, I'm not actually sure if the ROC would bother with this in the early 90s, since all it does is protect against Russia, but Russia would have recently collapsed into its modern form, and frankly it's not like having more land would actually do that much to stop the real threat that comes from war with Russia. India, however, is a little more interesting. See, there's this little nib at the northern border of India that is currently ruled by China, but has historically been claimed by the Republic of India, with the two even fighting a brief war over it in the 1960s, around the Sino-Soviet split. And of course, because it was a communist power invading a non-communist state, America immediately stepped in and did fuck all, actively allowing it because India wasn't hardline anti-communist enough, which totally makes sense. Instead, most of the foreign support that Delhi got came from the Soviets, not the West. So the question is, does this happen here? Well, without the people involved, the question is hard to answer, but Nehru would likely still make his original claim in the 40s, and with Manchuria, Mongolia, and East Turkestan under Soviet occupation or control in the 50s, it's not hard for Nanjing to feel boxed in. And then the US takes control over Korea and Vietnam. So, yeah, all three giants around China are pushing to carve it up again. As a result, I would fully expect to see the Sino-Indian War occur in the 1960s. This also likely leads to the ROC and Pakistan being friends. By the 1990s, the alignment in Asia would likely look something like this. China is friends with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Malaysia, Cambodia, and possibly Laos. In contrast, America still has allies in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, and the Philippines. Now, someone mentioned the idea that the Sino-Russian alliance would emerge in this timeline as well, in tandem with the Superpower Brazil, but I think I'll go a different route, largely because I want this video to be interesting and not just a rehash of our timeline. Thus, Russia continues to back Manchuria after both have moved on from communism to generic dictatorships. As a result, Russia remains a much closer ally of India, and China remains hostile to both the US and Russia. In addition, this China is likely filling a different economic niche than the PRC does in our timeline. See, while the Republic of China had greater trade ties to the rest of the world than the PRC did in our timeline, they still had pretty heavy trade restrictions on the Western countries, though these tariffs would likely be the subject of strong debate after the rise of the Republican Party of China in the 60s. Regardless, without Mao and with more organic industrialization, despite the top-down elements of Chiangism as an economic theory, this would mean that China is in a stronger position to move beyond just providing cheap goods. In addition, it's hard for democracies to maintain that sort of niche because they tend to have things like labor laws. As a result, by the 1990s, China will have long been a competitor to the US and have a role in the global economy more like the one it has now. In addition, China will have the mentality of being cornered, maybe not in every interaction it has with the West, but considering that every neighbor it has is either friendly to a major rival, or one such rival, it would underpin their strategic thinking. As a result of this, even with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 90s won't be a Pax Americana era of unipolar Yankee hegemony. Instead, the late 90s to early 2000s will see the Chinese seamlessly slip into this role as a rival. However, it won't be the same dynamic that the US had with the PRC or with the Soviets. It will be less about ideology and almost entirely about economics and baseline political supremacy. In addition, the two of them, like our US and China, would be important trade partners. As a result, I would compare the situation in this world's 1990s to the fears in the 80s about Japan taking over the world or a similar panic. In fact, China could wind up being a greater cultural exporter than in our world, with a freer press and easier immigration, as well as even older economic and diplomatic ties. Everything is set for China to have its own cultural exports like American comics and games, Japanese manga, and of course K-pop. Obviously, the details are very hard to predict, so I won't make any major commitments. Though I will point out that one of, if not the most famous manga and anime in history is already based on the journey to the West. Plus, the US does like kung fu movies, so maybe with a less restricted cultural exchange earlier on, those become bigger sooner. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out a lot, and I want to see just how far we can really grow. If you're already subscribed and want to show further support, I have channel memberships available for as little as $3 a month. Thank you so much for watching. Let's get right back to the show. It is also worth noting that China is a democracy and has been one since the 1960s in this world. By the end of the Cold War, I would expect the three parties to be the Nationalists, the Kuomantang, the Republicans, who I'm abbreviating as the GHD to make sure it's clearly distinct, and by this point, the Social Democrats would likely have emerged as a third party that challenges the other two. Google says the romanization looks like this, so we're going with SMD. I barely speak baby Spanish, I'm sorry. Now, the Republicans are more or less in favor of right-wing liberalism and cultural conservatism, while the Kuomantang continue Chiangist economics while adopting what I best describe as social conservatism and cultural progressivism. Namely, they support things that improve women's rights and education, while still supporting some elements of traditional family roles, and are more tolerant of Christianity in China. In contrast, the Social Democrats would be the Social Democrats. You know what they do. I would imagine that the 1960s would be a very Republican-dominated era in Chinese politics, as a rebellion against the Kuomantang rule that's existed more or less since the 1920s, with the 1970s being the emergence of actually close/competitive elections. The Social Democrats would be more or less on the back burner until the 1980s, likely not getting control over government until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, let's at least have some fun regarding map painting, or at least as much fun as we can in a post-war world where blatantly doing that is generally frowned upon. I could actually see China taking a keen interest in the Middle East in the 1950s to 1970s due to competition with India and the Soviets. Perhaps when the US is backing the Iranian Shah, a less ideological China seeks to back the Islamist revolutionaries, or even back a hitherto undetermined strongman in Iran or Iraq, moving the region toward them so as to broadly flank India and secure their own oil access. China would also likely see an alliance with Malaysia or even Singapore as vital to their own naval power and ability to project power and back up their various alliances. And this likely includes the artificial islands of our timeline coming into play even sooner due to the American alliance in Vietnam. While a Sino-Vietnamese war would quickly turn into World War III for all the same reasons that China can't mess with Taiwan in our world, Nanjing will absolutely be meddling in Indochina. In fact, let's talk about that area. Outside of China, this place is likely the most directly impacted by the changes we've made so far. Diem was blatantly authoritarian, and the country had a lot of coups in a very short amount of time. Like I said at the top, the US was able to invade Vietnam without a hostile China guaranteeing them, which in turn led to South Vietnam reuniting the country before 1970. However, the question is what the actual state of Vietnam would be like. However, Korea was also under one of the most brazenly corrupt republics possible, and had its own share of authoritarianism. So it's not like Vietnam couldn't liberalize. I also think that Vietnam would take on much of the outsourcing that the US and China got up to later on, since its military rule wouldn't have pesky things like working rights or labor unions, which would leave the region ripe for capitalist exploitation. However, this and the overrepresentation of the Catholic minority over the Buddhist majority throughout the 1960s and 1970s would likely strengthen the opposition, which could culminate in a revolution by the rank and file. How democratic such a move would be is up in the air though. I'm inclined to say not very, since such coups rarely turn out that way, and South Vietnam had a few moves against previous dictatorships despite lasting like 20 years. However, because I am openly biased in favor of democracy, I'm also going to say that by the 1980s they'll have transitioned to something a bit more democratic. The right will likely take a lot of cues from the Kuomintang in China, but I think the main opposition would be from the left with Social Democrats or New Deal types, rather than a right-wing liberal faction like the Chinese Republicans. Laos would also be highly impacted. For example, the country wouldn't have been bombed as excessively. However, I also think that would wind up in the Chinese sphere of influence due to tensions with Vietnam, as well as the fact that China just has an easier time trading with them and influencing the nation than the Yanks. Except, hold it, that's not true. During the 1950s, the Kingdom of Laos and the US were incredibly close, and we spent more on them than any other nation for foreign aid on a per capita basis. And with the short Vietnam War, this would hold true for a long time. While by the end of the Cold War, as China grows, it would absolutely be in contention, this wouldn't really apply at least until the 1980s or so. As a result, China would likely try to stage a coup or something to the effect in order to oust the pro-American influence, similar to our plans and operations all throughout Latin America. Because, well, it is kind of the same situation. After all, the two superpowers couldn't afford to allow the neighboring regions to support their main rival. Cambodia also goes down a very different route, since without the length of the Vietnam War, there wouldn't be a Viet Cong supply route going through the country, meaning no bombs, and from there no deposing of the king or civil war. The question is, what does this actually entail? Well, in the 1950s, Prince Sihanouk had abdicated and formed his own political party, using it to engage in a wildly corrupt and authoritarian, yet vaguely centrist, government. Despite this, however, he was decently popular. In addition, being more suspicious of the US than Vietnam or Laos, I think we finally found a friend for China in the region throughout the Cold War. Thus, by the 1990s, Cambodia and Laos are likely deep in the Chinese sphere of influence. Cambodia as a willing ally, and Laos as an associate. Now, this is a stretch, but I could actually see an Indochina war erupting around the 1980s or 1990s as a proxy war for the ROC and America, either because China sponsors the movement against Vietnam, which is a little bit of a hard sell, or because China wants to expand into Thailand. Now, I'm not actually sure how Thailand falls in the immediate shakeup of the region, but if Laos or Cambodia is able to take land from the country with Chinese support, then that could be beneficial for their control over those regimes, and it would likely see American support for Thailand for obvious reasons. Of course, the best case for China would be to cause instability in Vietnam and either turn into a quagmire that strains American logistics like the war on our timeline, or quickly ousting the American-supported government. However, this would be after nearly 20 years of Republican control, which makes it a bit harder for an outside power to cause something like this to happen. Not impossible, of course, but it would take luck. Now, such an Indochina war would be nearly impossible to predict, but such a gamble is very hard to make work for China, since either they're trying to prop up insurgents or covertly support their minor allies against a more powerful force without getting boots in the ground. If the Republic is going to put boots in the ground, then Thailand is going to have a pretty bad day, but that invites American soldiers and is a very dangerous escalation. Also, during the 1990s and 2000s, I think that China's bloc would begin expansion into the Middle East again. We already talked about Iran and Iraq as options, but Pakistan will also fall neatly in line. In fact, if forced to choose between Iran and Pakistan, I would readily assume China would opt for the latter. After all, it allows them to encircle India, have a way to ship around the Americans in Southeast Asia, and lets them remain friendly with countries like Iraq and Azerbaijan, giving it a greater diplomatic standing in the region as a whole than butting up with Iran would. Now, both the US and Russia will have their own spheres of influence in the Middle East and North Africa, especially the Russians, but I'm not sure what this actually looks like. If there's conflict between the major factions in the area during the Cold War, we could likely see China getting dragged into a Middle Eastern mess just like the US and Russia were. Of course, the US was hit with this a bit more infamously than the Russians, but if China is getting involved in these proxy wars to secure its own oil or anything, then yeah. As a rule, all three of the US, Russia, and China will be getting up to things in this general area, since China's diplomatic competition with both of them will be much older. Speaking of, what does all of this mean for the US? Well, since in this timeline a lot of the outsourcing went to Korea and Vietnam instead of China, that also just means there would be less outsourcing as a rule, since they don't have the labor pool or even the relative industry that China would have had. Though, to be fair, India would also be in a good position to get a lot of that labor. What this means is that the US remains a lot stronger in terms of domestic industrial power. In addition, the lack of a Red China, Vietnam War, or East Germany would likely moderate the anti-communist fears of the American public, in turn likely allowing the New Deal coalition to weather the storm of the 1970s and 1980s a bit better. Though by the 1990s, any 50-year-old establishment will begin to face challenges. As a result, the US would likely have a bit stronger of a welfare state, but the question is ultimately how the Republicans handle it. I doubt that Reagan comes to power just due to butterflies and divergent elections, but that obviously means that the details are incredibly different regarding the party system. Who knows, maybe Carter wins a second term and saves the world or something. The US dynamic with its Asian allies is also very different. Vietnam would become the primary ally we worry about defending rather than Taiwan or the now united Korea. If anything, the US is likely on positive terms with post-communist Manchuria, specifically due to their tensions with the Republic of China. However, I'd still put Manchuria in the Russian sphere of influence due to the land border supporting their logistics better. At least until something else shows how bad the actual Russian logistics are. Regardless, while the US presence in the South China Sea remains, now goes far beyond naval support. In effect, Vietnam now hosts a comparable amount of the American Navy and Army as Japan does, which likely ties back to how China is a bigger cultural export, except now it applies to Vietnam. I won't really say anything precise here, but it is worth noting. By the 2000s or 2010s, I think that the Republic might be willing to push against Manchuria. This remains a very dangerous gamble because of the Russian question, but frankly, without China's support throughout the preceding decades, I don't think that Russia will actually be able to contest it like the US is able to do for a certain other region. Such a war would be complicated. This would be a democratic state openly pursuing a war of conquest and nationalism, at best seen like the US and Iraq. That being said, North China is a dictatorship. As a result, the war would be incredibly controversial, and just as partisan as every other foreign event of the last 40 fucking years. In addition, both forces would be fighting a conventional war, and would have legitimate, powerful armies. But the ROC would obviously have the long-term advantages, and likely win out. The primary reason that the war wouldn't have happened sooner would still be Russia, but by 2009, I think they'd be up in the air as to whether or not Russia could actually stop the Republic of China. Their nuclear weapons could, but China's could force the issue for them as well. But I will admit, it wouldn't feel right to make a video with China as the protagonist and not have them reunify the whole country. But with that, I think that I need to end the scenario here. China enters the 2010s with a stable democracy, but with a recent conquest of Manchuria under its belt, the other great powers are wary. Competition with the Americans has been a long-standing problem for the Republic of China, and will likely continue to be, from Vietnam to Iraq and everywhere in between. At the same time, the two countries have a great degree of cultural exchange, with American superheroes and Chinese kung fu movies each being commonplace. Tensions are high throughout Asia due to the American presence in Vietnam and Korea and the Chinese responses. Now, before we go, I want to say a few things. Firstly, thank you guys for understanding the lack of a video last week for channel members, or a few weeks ago if you're watching this after that. I was fine after the accident, but the doctor did say to rest up. But with that out of the way, a big thank you to all of the channel members, Dubs Main, Grimswalt, Naufmunto, Trey, and Peter Darker for their support. In fact, thank you to Dubs Main, Grimswalt, Trey, and Peter Darker for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you all for watching, and join me next week as we explore another alternate world.